The first signs of the myth emerge as we recognize it, as it came passed down to us, was in the world of the Celts. It's pre-Christian. And it comes down through oral tradition, through the bards, the Welsh bards, principally, who migrated to Brittany in France. And because of historical forces at the time, it ended up in the courts of France as a bardic story, and was eventually written down in French by, forgive me, I don't have the correct accent. Christiane Dufoy. Thank you very much. And that was around, and the stories are placed as being written between 1190 and 1225. And the whole spectrum of Grail stories emerged in that time, 1190 to 1225. Written. This is the first written account of a whole series of Grail stories that were placed ostensibly in what later became known as Britain, but first emerged in France. And everything that came after that was built upon what was written in those approximately 50 years. Now, when people usually think of what the Grail story might be, they're usually getting their information from a version of the story that emerged sometime around 1600, which was Sir Thomas Malory's story, Morte d'Arthur. And that was really the bridge between those first stories and all that later emerged. It introduced the Grail to what was to become the modern world. Now, Malory's story took those earlier stories and sort of played down the spirituality and played up the romance, and the whole Lancelot and Guinevere thing got really prime time in that. And Arthur was a major figure. And the search for the Grail was in there, but not as prominent as it might have been in those earlier stories. And many of the elements of those earlier stories were not necessarily carried forward into Malory's story, because really he was more interested in chivalry and knighthood and the heroic code and all of those things, which in fact is disappearing by then. It was a form of nostalgia. They to try to capture it in this Grail story. But out of that, it just has on through the centuries. And so we get things like Wagner's Parsifal later as an opera. The man was so obsessed with the myth that he built a temple, a Grail temple, and this was the only place that his opera would be performed during his lifetime. Out of it we get Tennyson's poem, The Idols of the King, and right on through to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which is a direct retelling of the imagery of the Grail, but in terms of the wasteland, which he was perceiving our 20th century as becoming and reflecting. T.H. White, I think, back in the 60s, brought us The Once a Future King. That was a real taking up of Malory's, and boom, down to the 1960s. And then, with the oncoming of feminism, we get another way of looking at it. Doing the Myths of Babylon, which I found magnificent. I must say it was really my way into truly loving the myth in a way and having it personalized and given flesh. Highly recommended. I mean, even so far as when Tennyson wrote how the Grail cup just where it came in on a shaft of light into the round table. In the Myth of Babylon, it was being carried by Morgaine, who I believe was not biblical. Or if she was, the way the men decided to tell her that she wasn't there. It was just the cup they were seeing. Modern switch. Then, of course, there's what happened in the films, the movie. Someone already mentioned, that was terrific. He went off with his father, right? Searching for the Holy Grail. I loved it. I forget what that was, the last crusade? Was that the last crusade? Indiana last crusade? We're going to talk about this crusade. It was interesting that he named the film the last crusade. Monty Python?
Oh, yeah.
I know I said Monty Python. I don't know, did anybody really like that movie?
Oh, it's wonderful.
You liked it? I couldn't get everything.
The more you know about Arthurian legend, the funnier it gets.
Robin Williams is terrific in The Fisher King, which took the myth and put it right down in New York City. Beautiful. The wasteland underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. Excalibur is another one focusing on the sword. Star Wars. Star Wars is another retelling of the Grail story, but placed far into outer space and into the future. Luke Skywalker, is that his name? Was a Parsifal. And then, of course, there's Camelot. And that age of Camelot we were supposed to have had with the Kennedys, or at least Kennedy wanted us to have it. Paintings galore. And modern references which keep coming up more and more. You read the newspaper and whatever's going on, and it will refer back to, and this is their Holy Grail, or they're searching for their Holy Grail, or everyone's talking about the Holy Grail. Both Joseph Campbell and Jean Houston, still know Jean Houston? Hillary Clinton's occult consultant. So a lot of words in what she calls sacred psychology, have called the Grail the quintessential myth of the Western world and of our time. It is a Western myth, sure. What we're going to find out is that it didn't just come out of Europe, and that it in fact is related to the Near East, to the Far East, and not to mention the Celtic world, which is, may or may not be considered a part of Europe, depending upon how you want to define Europe, or the Europe that we now think of as a certain civilization. So it's a Western myth that sort of amalgamated a variety of cultural forces and emerged, and has come down through the centuries to us, and we're still talking about it. It's an esoteric subject, and at the same time it's popularized. Let's look at where it began, how it first emerged. It came out of a Europe that was basically a mess. It was, some say, a time not so different from our own, but perhaps somebody must have started a novel like that. It was a time not so different from our own. Perhaps all times are not so different from our own. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. On the one hand, Europe was in a state of social chaos, fragmentation, a whole lot of small kingdoms fighting amongst themselves, marauding bands of knights and bandits and no-gooders, and just seeing what they can get and who they could rape and what they could do, and, that kind of thing. There was famine, disease, bad weather, in general, not such a happy time for a lot of people. Could have helped to give birth to the image of the wasteland. It felt like that. The Catholic Church church at that time was the only social institution that could be a unifying force. That's important. And it was the main and most powerful political force in Europe at that time. And it intended to keep that. It was not only a spiritual or religious institution, it was a political institution. And it was the most powerful and the most pervasive and the most unifying in Europe at that time. So it was that on the one hand. On the other hand, it was post-millennium Europe. Now we're coming into a millennium. And analysts want to observe that whenever you come around a time of a millennium, there's a tremendous religious fervor that starts to get going. And the feelings about the end of the world. The end of the world is coming, and so everyone finds a kind of spirituality or some way to understand what's coming. Either to save their skins, to be one of the 350,000 elect who are going to get the rapture, or to anticipate a time when perhaps the apocalypse will bring the new creation, the second coming that Jesus promised. And so all of those forces were also at work at that time. Sometimes it was even kind of hysterical. I don't mean funny, although it could have been, but a religious hysteria, which on the one hand could give birth to the Inquisition, and on the other hand would give a certain desire on people's part to see miracles. They wanted a miracle. They wanted something outside of what appeared to be physical possibility. They wanted that to occur. And sometimes that longing for miracle would put itself into a fervent devotion to relics. Every church had its saint. Every church had its bones that people would come to have a cure when a miracle occur at. And it was, of course, a great profit for that local parish as well. Probably the single most important influence, I'll say on the Grail Myth. I don't know enough history to say on Europe at that time. I'll just say on the Grail Myth. The single most important influence was the Crusades. This was a period when they're in the midst of the Crusades, sort of trailing out of it. Certainly the ones to the Holy Land, which they had won and then promptly lost. It was real fast. They got it when they lost it. And we're sort of running back home to Europe and decided to launch a crusade on the Gnostics. But that's in Europe, but that's another story, and I'll get to that too. So let's do this first. We'll talk about the Crusades to the east. This was the time of the Crusade. And they went off to win their Holy Grail, which was Jerusalem. That was the religious impulse that was being touched. Underneath that, of course, were soldiers of fortune and people wanting to get booty and riches and wealth and all of that stuff too. But the spiritual impulse there was to win back the Holy Land from the pagans. That is, the Muslims, the people of Islam, who in fact, by our understanding of what pagan means now, weren't even pagans. They were believers in another faith. And guess what? That's what the Crusaders discovered when they got there. Certainly the elite of the Crusaders, which were the Knights Templars. Now, the Knights Templars are a very interesting bunch. I don't know, has anybody ever heard of them before, the Knights Templars? The Knights Templars were begun by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, is that how we say it? Who was either founder or at least associated with the abbot of the Cistercians. Was he the founder?
Founder.
So Saint Bernard was a reformer in the monastic tradition of the Cistercians. and at the same time founded these Knights Templars. And these knights were going to go off to Jerusalem and guard the road so that there could be safe passage between Europe and the Holy Land. And they put on the white robe. They had, the Knights Templars, the white robe of the Cistercian monks. But on it they had a red cross. These were warrior monks. Does that sound like a contradiction? Maybe, maybe not. They were warrior monks. And they were trained to be celibate, to be charitable, and to give their lives for, in the contemplative model, of a certain personal transformation that would bring us with their path toward God. They were an elite group, for sure. And it was this group that went to Jerusalem and were put into the temple there. It may have been the temple of Solomon. I'm sorry, I don't remember. It was important. In fact, in some cases, it became a model of what the Grail Temple, how it would be described. Don't remember, sorry. They, through the years, began to establish relationships with their enemies, the Moors, who they discovered to be highly cultured, highly educated, very spiritual, with a lot of interesting ideas and ways of expressing their spirituality. They also discovered there things like astrology, numbers, science of numbers, the tarot, alchemy, and they, when they returned to Europe, brought all of that back with them. And it was at this time, either parallel to their return, or perhaps influenced by their return, and the return of others from the Holy Land, reporting what they had learned and what they had seen, that developing at that same time was a certain Gnostic experiment, especially in southern Europe. The Cathars, the Albigensians. Now, Gnosticism, I'll try to define it. Others of you may know more about it. My understanding of it, and I'm not going to try to explain all of it, but basically Gnosticism is an affirmation of a personal experience of divine revelation. Gnosticism cut through the need for a priestly intervention. Now, there's more to it than that. And when the little bit I've read about them, some you could relate to, and some not, and some there's that whether or not Jesus was really God or really man, and they don't think they believe he could be both, things like that. But more important than that, the specifics of it, was their insistence on a personal relationship and access to the divine without the church. The Gnostics, I had access, we don't know if it was direct access or through oral tradition, to what's known as the Apocrypha. That is, the books of Scripture that were never included in the canon. And they were never included in the canon because they did not serve the political purposes of the church that was forming in the year 300 and something when it had that council and decided exactly what the canon would be. So many of the books that didn't suit that purpose were excluded. But these Gnostics were able to study them, reclaim them, and were building an experiment in community and in spirituality and devotion that was based upon that. The church perceived this experiment as a threat. And it was. And it was. was. And so, when it failed winning the Holy Land and their Holy Grail in Jerusalem was gone, they decided to get another crusade going, and they could just go down there and get rid of the Catholics. And the Albigensians, they did that. It was bloody, and it was a slaughter. There was a kind of inquisitions and fire burnings and all of those kinds of things. And they basically, seemingly wiped them out. There are those who say that the Knights Templars moved on. And I lived in Portugal for a time, and it turns out that that was quite a stronghold. There are those who say that Henry the Navigator and those early explorers were, in fact, Knights Templars. And if you remember, if you think back to the pictures you've seen, the white cloth and the red cross, they were eventually eliminated there, apparently. And there are those who say that they then metamorphed into what became the Masons. Some theories. The Masons of which our founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, were part of. That's just one theory. Don't take it, that's not fact like the Knights Templars is fact. All right. Now, the church found this Gnostic experiment unacceptable. The thing is that this was a time when Europe could have gone in another direction, because even apart from that, you've got St. Francis with his revelation and his stigmata bleeding and his challenge to the church also in terms of the corruption of the wealth and all of that was going on. Speaking of wealth, by the way, the Knights Templars had become very wealthy in the East, and that was perhaps even another reason for the extinguishing of them, because the church thinks of that as well. But that's St. Francis came, and he was another challenge to the church. I know that we were now passing into the age of the Holy Spirit. And in the age of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit spoke to the individual. And it was necessary to reject the church and the authority of the church in favor of the personal experience of the Spirit speaking. So there were all of these forces at work, and Europe could have gone in another direction, but the church was powerful. It didn't. It took St. Francis, said what he said, and how many people have heard of it. The things sort of got incorporated into structure as existed. But what did come through was the emerging primacy of the individual. There was a new psychological orientation toward the integrity and the sacredness of the individual soul and its ability to access spiritual truth. Essentially, the Grail myths are about this. Their personal journey.
What was the thinking before that came about?
That the community, that the institution, that authority, whether in the form of the church or the king, had primacy over my own individual experience and my own impulse and my own experience with God speaking to me, through me, in me. Now, Joseph Campbell has done some interesting work on this, and when he talks about the Grail and the power of myth, somebody mentioned it. The simultaneous with all of this was the rising of the courts of love, the troubadours. And what emerged at this time was the concept of amour, love. Personal, romantic love, which was different from eros, which was basically lust, which was basically impersonal. It's like a biological response. Boom, you go. Different from eros, and different from agape, which was also, as beautiful as it was, impersonal. It's just a generalized love of humanity or of the community. Eros was one-to-one. Amour was one-to-one. And it did not need to have sex as part of it in order to exist. In fact, very often, the ideal of courtly love is that you wouldn't consummate it. You would love somebody who was unavailable to you. She was married, for example. Yet you would have a devotion to it. It was acceptable. It was socially included. It just wouldn't be consummated sexually. And this was an acceptable form of expression. All the poems and all the troubadour songs were about this rise of a Moor. Why do you think they separated it out from sex? It didn't have to be, but it was very often.
It wasn't just in France that this arose.
Because,
the rest of Europe.
right. But it was in France that the Grail Myth arose.
Right.
And wasn't it always adulterous?
Excuse me?
It was always adulterous. I mean, the mistress was unattainable because she was already taken.
Right, and very often by the king, somebody who was, you wouldn't want to betray. But it was important because it was one of the important factors in the Arthurian legends, in the Grail myths, which were ostensibly in Britain, which was a Lancelot and Guinevere story. All right, so here we got the force of love and the Moor and the rights of the individual. And it was like, something new was opening up. And into all of this, on the one hand, social chaos, on the other hand, this devotional fervor, this desire, this longing of union with the divine, which the Moor was part of. This love would become a path toward union with the divine. Into all of this, and into these courts comes the Welsh bard, telling these magical, fantastical stories of fairies and shapeshifters and disappearing castles and other worlds that exist simultaneous with the physical world, and you can just sort of go through a mist and pass over into another world that's like a parallel universe. Sounds like Star Trek. So these came into these courts, and because that also combined with some of those Eastern influences which were coming in. And the mystical influences of the Sufi, and Rumi, the poet, in his devotion to the beloved as a spiritual path, was there also. And all of this came together and became the Grail Myth. I've given you some maps that will, you can take with you, and basically can help you understand this progression, this movement. Anybody doesn't have a map? It's a sheet of paper, two-sided. Oh, it is. Sheet of paper down. Thank you. So, see map number 1, the Earl of Crazy. How do you say his name, Helen? Crazy-Anne. The movement out of Ireland into Wales, where the bards picked up on it, and then they migrated into Brittany. The emergence of courts and peers with Crazy-Anne's version of the Grail, first version of the Grail emerged. Map number 2 shows the circles of influence that were at work at that time. The largest, of course, was coming out of the Middle East and through the Crusades. Who would have thought? Because, of course, the Knights Templars were the example of the Grail Knight. Coming out of North Africa and up through the Iberian Peninsula, which is where those Cathar, now the Genzian communities live, was one of the influences. And then coming from the Celtic world. Again, also coming up at that time was the natural sciences, which in fact the Moors had in fact gone very far. And that information has been lost in the Dark Ages, and it was sort of being recaptured now through the Middle East. So the sciences were beginning to emerge at that time also, in addition to the occult sciences, pseudosciences, or maybe pseudosciences. I'm going to stop there, all right? And if you want to do card changes and stuff like that, we'll take a little break.